First of all, thank you so much for buying this video playbook. I hope you enjoy it. Over the next 3 videos, I'm going to be sharing some hints and tips and ideas, inspiration for you to make your own autumn themed door wreaths. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Julie from Julie Davis Flower Workshops and Flower Start, the online flower arranging classes. I'd love to see your interpretation of the projects I'm going to share with you. I'd love it if you shared some photos over in my free Facebook group Flower Start World, or perhaps you'd like to tag me on Instagram. You'll find me at Flower Start with an underscore at the end and use the hashtag Flower Start. I know that's a lot to remember, so I've left all those details in the show notes underneath this video. For the first project, I'm going to show you how to make a dried flower wreath using a straw base. You may already have a stash of dried flowers at home. Perhaps you've got them in storage waiting for that perfect project, or perhaps you've had them out on display. I've had this display on my side for a few months now. I'm getting a little bit fed up with it and it's starting to attract the dust, so I'm going to revamp this vase and use that to make my door wreath. This is the base I'm going to be using, pre-made and readily available from hobby and craft shops as well as online. And if you're not sure where to buy them, I've left a link for the details, again underneath the video. Now before you get started, just a word of caution. We're using dried flowers that do get quite brittle and you may get a lot of breakages and it will create one heck of a mess whenever you're working. So I'd do this in your kitchen if I were you, or somewhere that hasn't got a carpeted floor so you can easily sweep up and tidy away afterwards. And although I'm calling it a door wreath, you don't have to hang your wreath on your front door, and in fact it might be a good idea not to. If your front door is exposed to the wind and the rain, you may find it gets damaged really easily or starts even in the moist weather to go mouldy. So have a think about where you could put your door wreath inside. You might want to prop it up on your mantelpiece, even take one of your pictures off the wall and hang it up there instead. As with all creative projects, don't rush at it, take your time. This is a 2-stage project really. The first one is making your bundles of dried materials and the second one is actually fixing them onto your wreath base. Right, with all that said and done, let's get started. As I've already said, for this project I'm going to be using a straw wreath base. This one is about 30 centimetres in diameter and you can get them in all sorts of sizes. Just double check you know what you're buying if you decide to shop online. I've got some brown string to bind my bundled materials onto my wreath, and I'm going to make the bundles up by using my mossing wire or binding wire. I've got my floristry scissors and then a selection of dried materials. This is lavender and this is some wheat, and I've got some poppy heads too. The first thing I'm going to do is to cut my materials to length, and as a rule of thumb I normally cut them about 8 to 10 centimetres long, but it's entirely up to you, and you're going to have to do an awful lot of cutting in order to make up enough bundles to go all the way around your wreath. And for my bundles I've decided to use 3 ears of corn, 2 pieces of lavender and 1 poppy head, and then I take my binding wire or mossing wire and wrap that around the bundle to hold everything in place. Having cut the binding wire off the reel, I would then twist the 2 cut ends together just to make your bundle extra secure so it's not going to fall apart when you put it down on the table. If you lie the cut ends, the tiny ends at the end, smooth with the stems of your little posy, hopefully then you won't scratch yourself as you work. It's really hard to say how many bundles you'll need to make up because it will depend on the size of the wreath frame that you're going to be using. It also depends on the type of materials you're using as well. Are you using things that are naturally bushy, or like me, things that are quite short and straight? The more compact your bundles, the more you'll need to go all the way around your wreath base. And of course you may decide you don't want to go all the way around your wreath. You may just want to create a beautiful accent area and bind the rest of your wreath with rope or cord to disguise the straw base. Do you remember at the beginning of the video when I said this is a project of 2 halves? I really would think of it in that way. So sit down and make up your bundles first of all, and then when you've got a good quantity, that's when I'd start binding them onto the wreath frame. So as a starting point, I think you probably need to make around about 30 to get going, and you'll see towards the end of this video I had to remake additional bundles twice before I actually had enough to complete the whole project. And once you've cracked the technique, well, you just keep going and going. I've speeded up this section of film so you can see my growing pile of bundles and my diminishing pile of raw materials. And when you've got a good supply of the bundled materials to one side, you can then start thinking about attaching them onto your wreath frame. So I'm going to do this using my brown garden twine. So I just knot it onto the wreath base. I do a double knot and then I am ready to go. So you need to decide which way you're going to work, whether you're going to go anti-clockwise or clockwise, whichever suits you. But once you start putting your bundle of materials onto your wreath frame, you do need to keep going in the same direction every time. So you can see here, I've put my first bundle on and I kind of protect it with my hand. And then with the other hand, I bind the string over the stems a couple of times. And I've put this first placement straight on top of the wreath. And the second placement I'm putting off to the right of it is going in towards the centre of the wreath. And the third placement that I'll add in goes to the outer edge of the wreath. And I keep working on this sort of herringbone pattern. One to the middle, one to the side, one to the other side. So really it's top, middle, outside, top, middle, outside. One thing you'll also need to think about is how densely you put your materials on, how densely packed they're going to be. So the closer you pack your materials, the fuller and the more exuberant your door wreath will be. But of course you'll run out of materials very quickly. So what I tend to do is to aim to put the bushy heads onto the wreath to cover up the stems and then shuffle it down a little bit. And then you can see what I'm doing here, trying to demonstrate more clearly the herringbone technique that I was talking about before. So putting one piece down in the middle, one to one side, one to the other, one in the middle, one to the one side and one to the other. And once you get the routine, you'll be off and raring to go. As you bind your materials on, you will need to pull your string really tautly. So it's the tightness of the string that is holding the bundles in place. The string, sometimes if you put it on too loosely or don't pull it enough, it'll loosen and then your bundles will slide out of position. And for this reason, it's possible, if you're struggling with the string, that you might prefer to use the mossing or binding wire that you use to tie your bundles with, but do take care with that because it will pull and hold really well. But if you brace the wire up against your fingers, you do run the risk that you're going to cut yourself because the wire will dig into you. You'll start to get in a rhythm with the placing of your materials, and what I tend to do is, if I have any shorter or smaller bundles, I save those for the inside edge so they can lie neatly without crowding that central hole of my wreath, and save the bushier and fuller bits to the top surface of the wreath and to the outer edge too. So when you've got about a quarter of the way around like this, have a look, see whether you like the way your materials are being spaced, see whether you like the size that you're creating, and at this stage you could unwind what you've already done and start again. But what I'm showing you here is you do need to make sure you're putting the materials on the inside edge and bringing them down to the outside edge, remembering that your wreath isn't just the front face of it, it does have these two other sides as well. So you're thinking about the three sides: the top, the middle, the edge, the top, the middle, the edge, the top, the middle, the edge, and you'll probably find yourself reciting that as you go all the way around. Now I'm going to speed up the next bit of film just so you can sort of see it as a time lapse what I'm doing, but I'm doing exactly the same thing as I'm doing here: top, middle, edge, top, middle, edge, making sure the bushy heads of the stems cover up, making sure the bushy heads of the bundle cover up the stems of the previous bundle. So really you're using the bushy heads to disguise the fact you've got the straight stems, and also disguising your binding. So you're binding on the straight stems, and the next bushy heads you add in will cover up your workings. So by the time you finished your wreath, you should just see all the beautiful materials, and you shouldn't be able to see the string that went over and over and over the stems. As you work, make sure your wreath is of a consistent thickness. You don't want to suddenly discover that you started spacing out your materials more, and that meant you got a skinny bit around the edge of the wreath. You, of course, don't need to go all the way around your wreath. If you've run out of materials or you like the look that you've got as is, why not bind the rest of the wreath with some string or some thicker twine and just wrap that over and over and over as a decorative finish to disguise the straw base. I'm not going to do that, but it is an option if you do get fed up or you run out of materials. I can't do any more with my door wreath at the moment because I've run out of my bundled materials. So here you see me again for the second time batching together the little bundles. So I've got 3 ears of wheat, 2 stems of lavender and 1 poppy head per bundle. And I have got some items that I've substituted in because I did start to run out of materials. So you will see some sea lavender creeping in, and also some barley, which is very similar to the wheat as well. So exactly the same technique as before, putting the bundles together in my hand, binding them with the mossing wire, the binding wire, and fingers crossed, I'm hoping I've got enough materials this time around. Of course, spoiler alert, I know I haven't, and I still had to make another bundle of materials right at the end, but I'll tell you more about that when we get there. Don't put yourself under pressure to think that you have to complete your wreath in one setting. You can see here that as I stop to make more bundles, I just push my wreath to the side, tighten up the string and leave it. It doesn't unwind, it doesn't come apart, so it is something that you can put aside and come back to, later on the day or the following day. So you might want to put your wreath on a tray, just make sure the string isn't going to roll around, and just pack everything away and come back to it when you're feeling ready for it. The one thing I didn't do was tie my string off and cut it. I've kept the string on one continuous length, and you will see me getting a bit of a pickle with my string. It is an older reel, and I'm pulling the string from the centre, and you'll see that every so often the tails of the string keep falling out, which is a bit problematic, but it's just one of those things, and you need to be able to work with it. So here I'm continuing on top, middle edge, round and round, and then I will get back to where I started from, and this is where I discover that I need even more bundles to make. So I'll let you watch this little bit and then tell you what I did next. At this point I've nearly finished my wreath, and you can see I've only got a short section of the bare straw base to cover up. But actually I've got a little bit more to cover up than you can actually see, because I need to make sure that the last placement of my little posy bundles sits underneath the head of the bundle that I put on first of all. So you actually need to lift up the very first bundle you attached onto your wreath and slide the stems underneath. And because your materials are brittle, it's quite tricky to do this. If you've ever made a fresh wreath, the materials are more pliable and you can gently lift them up and out of the way so you can tuck the last stems in. So this is what you see me doing here, getting it in a bit of a muddle with my string that isn't playing ball with me, but I am carefully wrapping the string around the stems, and then the last lot of placement, as I say, lifting up the first lot of heads and sliding the stems underneath. And before I could do that last little bit to make that seamless transition, so you can't see where I started the wreath and where I finished, it's a continuous flow of materials, I need to make even more bundles. And working on my side middle edge, I reckon I've got 6 more bundles to make up to get that lovely invisible join that is a sign of a well-made door wreath. Here I've turned the door wreath round a bit so you can see this joining section more clearly. So I am very carefully thinking about my placements, holding them in place, binding them round with my string whilst running the string underneath the heads of those very first stems that I attached. And you do need to go really slowly and carefully at this point. It's not a sort of free form wrapping. You're going to intricately have to go round your materials. And you can see here that I'm sort of in and out, making sure my string isn't catching on the stems that I have already added in. I don't want anything to break at this point, and I certainly don't want to be making up any new bundles of materials. So it is slow and steady progress until you're satisfied that there is a seamless transition from the beginning right the way through to the end of your door wreath. So you have got a little bit of play with fixing materials in, but just go carefully, especially when you are picking up the heads of the first posy bundle that you put in. You don't want to be a bit heavy-handed and suddenly discover that you have snapped the heads off. Now, of course, there is a cheat, and the cheat to this is that if anything gets broken, you could always go in with your glue gun afterwards and just do a few running repairs with the occasional stem. But it's certainly not the answer from, as a construction technique right from the beginning. But if it helps you to just finish off seamlessly, don't feel that you've got to do it all with the binding technique. You can go in afterwards and sort of add in extra materials. If you think, for instance, there's any sort of bald patches or thinner patches, go back in and glue in extra materials. So here I'm showing you, I've actually now cut my string off the main reel just for the last few bindings round. And this is what the back of the door wreath looks like. You can see my over string going around the wreath, and you can see that all my materials are on the underneath now. So I'm being very careful not to push too heavily as I tie off my last bit of string. But it's always quite interesting, I think, to see the back of your wreath. You can really understand the construction process. It's nice and flat at the back, so it will lie firmly and squarely on the door or against the wall, wherever I'm going to put it. And this is the finished wreath. So you might want to preen if you've caught your string in and you've caught your materials down. Just ease them out, let them sit naturally. And as I say, if you do discover that there's things that are a bit wayward, you could always go in with a pair of scissors and cut out one or two items. Or if you think perhaps the materials aren't evenly spread, well then go back round and glue in some items afterwards. There's nearly always a little bit of a bald patch you suddenly notice when you've actually finished, and that's why I always say, when you think you've finished work, go away, have a cup of tea, stand back, and with fresh eyes look at your work and just see whether it is as you planned it to be, or whether it could do with a few extra placements of materials. And here I might need to add in a stem or two of poppy or wheat, and just to make sure I've covered up all the bald spots if I've got any. And in fact, at the end of it, I think I added in another piece of wheat, another poppy head, and I think I did cut off one of the stems of wheat because it did seem to be very, very long compared to the rest. I can't wait to see how you interpret this project. And there's just two things to bear in mind. Stick with your bundling technique and bundle your materials up, and that way they won't fall apart. But if you get more confident, you could attach them in your hand direct to the wreath base, but I think that does need some practice. And then the second technique, of course, is that binding technique, using your string or your mossing wire to attach your materials onto your base, and then trying to get that seamless join so you can't see where the materials started and where your finishing point was. And as I said before, if all else fails, or you get fed up, or you just think there's a gap, you could use a hot glue gun to add in extra materials, and of course add a big bow to cover the gap, or use that binding technique and use some decorative twine to cover up your gap. Is another great idea.